Okay, so this video we're going to start on chapter 7 from John Dewey's Art as Experience. Title of this chapter is The Natural History of Form. And again, I'm going to try to keep these videos, these later ones, shorter. So I'm going to split this chapter up. There's a little bit more to cover than we did in our last chapter. So I'm going to split split this chapter up into two separate videos. And we'll go ahead and start. We're going to repeat the quote I left, I ended with last time. This is the beginning of the chapter where Dewey gives us his definition of form. And for those of you who are taking my class at U of H and you're watching this for that reason, this is one of those videos of Dewey's, but you can go ahead and skip ahead to the end. This is not necessary for an understanding of Dewey, although I think that this will, if you're still kind of, curious and want to learn more, by all means, stick around for this one. So again, let's reread this quote. We'll get started with this and move on and see where he's going with it, right? Again, the title of the chapter is The History of Form, right? And so we really actually won't get to that, the sort of a direct addressing of that, the history of form and artistic form, until probably the next video, okay? In a sense, what we're going to do here is kind of elaborating even more on Dewey's concept, what he means by form in art, okay? We already talked about that in the previous video, and now we're going to elaborate on it some more. So here, again, in this quote, I mentioned the last video at the end. This, we get a pretty straightforward, generic definition of form from Dewey. It's all italicized here. But let's read the full quote. Form is a character of every experience that is an experience. Right? So you might have to review chapter 3 if you're not quite sure of the distinction between experience in general and an experience in Dewey's sense. But again, form always has, form is a character of every experience that is of that quality. So art in its specific sense enacts more deliberately and fully the conditions that affect this unity. So anything that's an experience, when we see it in artistic form, it will enact this even more deliberately and fully. So form, he wants to say, and this is all the italicized stuff, so this is his sort of generic definition of form. Form may then be defined as the operation of forces that carry the experience of an event, object, scene, and situation to its integral fulfillment. I think the last video, the last lecture on Dewey, we focused on that integral part. There's this unity and cohesion of a work of art, of a product of art, and that's definitely, in a sense, what he means by form. But that notion of fulfillment, this is something that runs throughout Dewey's aesthetics, but he hasn't really mentioned it in the context of form, so he's going to elaborate on that a little bit more here. The problem of discovering the nature of form is thus identical with that of discovering the means by which are affected the carrying forward of an experience to fulfillment. Okay, so fulfillment itself is, an essential aspect of form. We need to understand that to understand form. When we know these means, we know the means that will carry forward our actions to fulfillment, we know what form is. While it is true that every matter has its own form or is intimately individual, we talked about that in more detail in the last chapter. Dewey says there are general conditions involved in the orderly development of any subject matter to its completion, since only when these conditions are met does a unified perception take place, right? So why do I have the picture here of the pizza in the oven that's just destroyed and gloopily glooped, all the dough is falling apart and ruined, and then you have this one on the right that's all, nice and golden brown and crispy looking and it comes out just right. So I just, to illustrate kind of his point, I think what he's trying to say here, there's this process that's involved in, let's say I go online to find a recipe for a pizza that I want to make a pizza at home that's the style that I like, right? This sort of crispy crust New York style pizza. So I go on the internet, I find this recipe, okay? And so like he says, right, there's this carrying forward of experience to fulfillment. Okay, so I have this plan in place to create this pizza, and I want to bring that into fulfillment. We know these means, right? I know what ingredients I'm going to need. I need an oven, that's sort of cooking utensils, all that sort of stuff that I'm going to need to create this, to make the recipe complete, right? To use the recipe to make this pizza. Um, So there's general conditions involved in the orderly development of any subject matter. In this case, I'm using the example of cooking, since only when these are met does a unified perception take place, right? So when I fail, right, like maybe I don't put enough, I put too much water in the dough, or not enough, whatever baking powder. I've never really made pizza dough, so I have no idea what what brought this about on the left here and why it failed, right? Maybe because he tried to put it directly on the grades or something like this. But for Dewey, let me back up here to do that. For Dewey, there's no consummation here, right? This is all sort of chaotic. You got the ingredients, everything sort of is working. It's sort of great. You throw the thing in the oven, then you open it up, and it's just a freaking mess, And there's no consummation, right? It's an unaesthetic in that sense. I kind of like this in a way, right? It's like, all of us have had that experience, right, where we screw up a recipe, or something clumsy happens, and after we've really been trying really hard to accomplish something, some just silly accident just throws it all off and everything falls apart, right? There's this kind of sense of being let down and unsatisfactory. It has nothing to do with an ethical value. It's more like, I think Dewey's right. It's like it's an aesthetic value. There's something unaesthetic about it that sort of upsets us. We were expecting this golden brown. Excuse me. We were expecting this this golden brown crispy pizza on the right that we saw in the picture online when we were looking up the recipe. And we were excited. We went to go get all these fresh ingredients, these vegetables, and we cut up the bell peppers. And then everything just sort of falls apart, right? It's just that sort of like, it just doesn't quite work. Okay, so again, a form for him, it doesn't just involve the organization of all of the elements of a work of art and how they go together, right? That's part of it, right? That's the integration part, right? This is integral fulfillment, okay? But it's not just that integration. It's not just the spatial properties. It's not just the meaning. We spoke about that in the previous lecture. But it also has something to do with this notion of fulfillment, completion. Okay, that's a part of form. That's an intrinsic part of form for Dewey. There can be no movement, he says, towards a consummating close unless there's a progressive massing of values, a cumulative effect. Right. So as I make this recipe, I'm getting closer and closer to the fulfillment of that pizza I desire, right? Creating that pizza I desire. This result cannot exist without conservation of the import of what has gone before, right? One step after another. Once I dice up my veggies, I've got to roll the dough, and so there's a sort of stacking of steps, and one sort of completes the other. Moreover, to secure the needed continuity, the accumulated experience must be such as to create suspense and anticipation of resolution, right? Is the dough going to rise the way I want it to, right? Are those bell peppers, are they sliced enough to where they're going to be cooked all the way through? Are they still going to be cold, when the cheese is bubbling or whatever, okay? Accumulation is at the same time preparation, as with each phase of the growth of a living embryo. Right, so art has this sort of an analogous relation to the development of an embryo. Right, every stage of progresses through this work of art. I think this is really obvious. I guess as a sculptor chipping away at the marble, you kind of like each little step prepares for the next one. And if he slips and screws up and chips off a little too much, it could kind of ruin the whole experience. Sort of like this pizza here on the left. So such characteristics as continuity, accumulation, conservation, tension, and anticipation are thus formal conditions of aesthetic form. So he's adding a little bit more to his notion of form here at the beginning of this chapter. We already talked about, again, in the previous video, about space and the organization of space as a part of form. We also talked about meaning as a part of form, and even sort of functionality and grace and things like this. But now he's talking about continuity, accumulation, conservation, anticipation. All of these things are also formal conditions of aesthetic form. The factor of resistance is worth a special notice at this point. Without internal tension, there would be a fluid rush to a straightaway mark. He keeps bringing up this tension. Remember, the live creature, we're all living creatures. There's always this tension with the environment. That's where he first mentions this notion of tension and strife. He seems to think that all aesthetic experience has to be a resolution of a certain tension. So again, otherwise, we talked about this in the chapter on expression. If I just blurt out my emotions and just scream the anger that I have within me, for him, that's just a straight, a discharge. It's not a form of artistic expression. There has to be some sort of tension or strife. This impulse has to be channeled through some artistic medium. So again, to repeat, without internal tension, there'd be no fluid rush. Sorry, there would be a fluid rush to a straightaway mark. There would be nothing that could be called development and fulfillment. The existence of resistance defines the place of intelligence in the production of an object of fine art. This is what makes humans, and I guess the mind, the human ability to use our brain and rationalize and to envision more possibilities than other biological beings. This is what makes us artists, I suppose. And this what distinguishes us from animals and their aesthetic experience. So the existence of resistance, as he puts it, defines a place of intelligence. He might even broaden it. Remember, in previous lectures, he even seems to think that animals, in a certain sense, are, performing, at least they do things aesthetically. They have some sort of aesthetic experience, maybe not quite as complex and variegated as humans, but nevertheless aesthetic in some sense. There's this resistance, there's strife, and there's a dealing with it, right? There's a working through those oppositions with material, right? Through the environment with artistic media that help you express that impulse that draws you outwards, right, towards something that like an emotion you feel, or an object that you crave, right, an object you desire. The difficulties to be overcome in bringing about the proper reciprocal adaptation of parts constitute what in intellectual work are problems. In art, the resistance encountered enters into the work in a more immediate way than in science. So science, again, there's a similar, and we talked about this in previous lectures, there's a similar phenomenon in intellectual work, in the work of the scientific person, as they're trying to find out the answer to their scientific problem that they're working with at the moment. But it's a lot more, it's more immediate, as he puts it, in art than it is in science. So how so? Well, here he explains in this quote, right? I'm looking at this picture here. I'll explain in a minute why I have it with this slide, right? We have art installation, just like we did in that last, right? These are art installations, right? Obviously, the artist here is working with form. If Dewey is right, form is, a constituent element of any art product. But form, again, it's how the light plays off of the objects that are hanging, creating this effect and the shadows and all that stuff. There's a tension of the way that they're organized. You might not like this piece, right? You might not enjoy installation work, but nevertheless, the artist, might have had some vision and was limited by the space and had to work with this space, right? So there's a certain resistance and an overcoming of that resistance finally once the object is realized in a work of art. So a rigid predetermination of an end product, whether by artist or beholder, leads to the turning out of a mechanical or academic product. You know, he's already said something like this before in previous chapters, right? So, you know, we have this, if we're an artist, or even here he mentions if we're a beholder, right? If we're somebody who's going to look at a work of art and just enjoy it, and not actually be an artist ourselves. In either case, you know, there's some sort of emotion or some intention behind our endeavor, right? Why are we doing what we're doing? If we're an artist, why am I creating this thing? There's something I want to express. I have this image in my mind, right? If I'm like one of these artists here, Kavanaugh and Nguyen, you know, before they created this art installation, they were just looking at an empty room. They probably had an idea in their mind of what they wanted to do, right? They're using all these materials, these wood planks, and they want to organize them in a certain way, but they're limited by the dimensions of the space and the lighting. And so as I imagine, as they're constructing this installation piece, I'm sure they had a lot of assistants to help them. There were certain obstacles in the way, gravity, and the way that they organized all these different threads and strands in the room, right? Obstacles presented themselves, and so perhaps the work as they envisioned it in their mind wasn't exactly as it appears here in the gallery as they're standing and looking at it, right? But they had a general purpose, a general intention, and the work developed through this struggle, right? Through this interaction of artist and material and space and all this, and it all cohered into what I think is a pretty cool looking installation piece. So like the scientific inquirer, the artist permits the subject matter of his perception in connection with the problems it presents to determine the issue, instead of insisting upon its agreement with the conclusion decided upon in advance. So again, like the scientist allows the information, the formula to sort of to steer his path towards truth, the artist as well is going to allow, you know, some unforeseen obstacles, you know, instead of trying to get them to rigidly fit some predetermined design or blueprint in the artist's mind. The artist can work with them and adapt to them. And you know, so for Dewey, it's not just this sort of straight one-to-one correspondence between the impulse, the inspiration, and then the end product, right? There's this struggle, there's this development, and there's this, you know, accumulation, and finally, you know, what's the word he's using so much in this chapter? Fulfillment, right? A sort of fulfillment. The unexpected turn, something which the artist himself does not definitely foresee, is a condition of the felicitous quality of a work of art. So there's a sort of luck involved in works of art, sort of a felicitous quality, as he puts it. It saves it from being mechanical, right? This sort of ability to adapt to something unforeseen gives art this quality that makes it less mechanical. It gives the spontaneity of the unpremeditated to what would otherwise be a fruit of calculation. The painter and poet, like the scientific inquirer, knows the delights of discovery. Those who carry on their work as a demonstration of a preconceived thesis may have the joys of egotistic success, but not that of fulfillment of an experience for its own sake. And you know, for Dewey, that's the essence of art, right? And remember the title of the book, Art as Experience. So I have a picture here of Bob from Twin Peaks, if you're familiar with the series from the late 80s, early 90s, right? Kind of a weird, wacky series by a very eccentric filmmaker, David Lynch, one of my favorites, by the way. So I get a bit of a bias here towards Lynch. I love his work. But this is a picture of Bob, right? Evil Bob from Twin Peaks. And the story behind this is why I use this image. This guy, the actor, I forget his name, he was just a crew member, right? I think he was a camera guy or a grip, right? He held the lights. And they were shooting a scene, I think it was in the pilot episode of the first episode. And one of the guys on the set said, cut, and David Lynch is like, what's wrong? They said, hey, homeboy was back there behind the bed. He was crouched in the corner. He's in the shot. We got to shoot it over again. And David Lynch was like, no, you know what? I think I'm going to keep that there. I want to keep him in the scene, right? You can barely see it. You got to really look. It's not easy to catch, but he's in that scene. And then eventually throughout the series, Mark Frost and David Lynch kind of developed this character of Bob, right? He was this creepy, like evil demon spirit who haunts Laura Palmer and all these other people in the town of Twin Peaks, right? So again, this is an example of, I think, what Dewey's talking about, right? In the process of creating, David Lynch might have had a general view of the kind of aesthetic of the show that he was producing, right? He had certain things that he wanted to do. He had ideas in his mind, and then little mistakes happen on the set, and he could have just said, okay, well, let's reshoot the scene, but instead he thought, well, you know what? That kind of looked creepy. The guy looks kind of weird crouched down like that. Let's leave it in there. No one will notice it. It's kind of hard to tell. I didn't even notice it. And then they eventually actually wrote it into the show. So when we talk about the end of artistic creation, the end as in the when we're finished with it, but also as in the purpose. Here he's talking about the consumatory phase, right? So end as in the actual end, right? When we're finished with the work of art. The consumatory phase is recurrent throughout a work of art. Okay, so once the work is done, in a sense, it's not really done. Okay, it recurs. So what does he mean here? How does once Salvador Dali finishes painting this beautiful canvas, the hallucinogenic Toreador, how is it that this consumatory phase, once he signs the canvas, how is it recurrent through a work of art? So it's not just recurrent through a work of art, but it's also in the experience of a great work of art. The points of its incidence shift in successive observations of it. What he's talking about here, I don't think we've heard anybody talk about this semester. If you're in my class at University of Houston, maybe David Hume. Remember when David Hume, in his article, his essay, The Standard of Taste, he talks about how somebody can develop a refined taste. And the way that you do this, the way that you develop a good taste of music and art, is by revisiting certain works of art. Things that you might not notice, subtleties and things like that will jump out at you. And Dewey is saying something similar here, but for different reasons, okay? So he's saying that once the art product is created, the product is the painting, the work actually continues, right? And so he's going to talk more about this distinction later in the last chapter. I don't know why he waits till the end to do it. He even says when he finally explains this distinction between art products and art works, he admits that this distinction has been implicit throughout, right? But anyway, so the work of art, the actual work, not the product, not the painting, it has this sort of recurrence. And in the experience of a great work of art, the points of its incidence shift in successive observations of it. In other words, we see more things, different things that we didn't see before. When I revisit this canvas by Salvador Dali, I might not have noticed a face, right? I'm looking at the torso of these 3 or 4 women figures, right? I'm looking at them as like they look like the Venus de Milo, right? Then if you sort of step back, you can see a nose and a mouth, and it's a face, right? And then I didn't even notice those flies at the bottom, and there's another figure there on the left, right? This canvas has this depth and complexity. It might, spark new experiences in me with each subsequent viewing. This fact, Dewey writes, sets the insuperable barrier between mechanical production and use and aesthetic creation and perception. The work, in the sense of working of an object of art, does not cease when the direct act of perception stops. So when I'm done looking at this painting, the actual artwork continues. The work, after I leave the room and stop looking at the painting, it haunts me, right? I'm still thinking about it. I'm still thinking about the imagery. It still affects me. It continues to operate in indirect channels. Indeed, persons who draw back at the mention of instrumental in connection with art often glorify art for precisely the enduring serenity, refreshment, or re-education of vision that are induced by it. Another feature too, so I think we've said enough about this notion of fulfillment, what he's calling here the consumatory phase. That's an essential element of form. But he also mentioned skill. This is something that I think might make a philosopher like Schopenhauer and Kant scoff. And either other philosophers of art, right? I think, Dewey keeps railing throughout this book against what he calls the esoteric conception of art, the sort of snobby art museum conception of art. And I think that kind of snobby view of art also tends to think of virtuosity and skill as something kind of showy and show-offy. And so it's something for entertainment, for pop culture, but not for fine arts, not for this highbrow fine arts. But Dewey disagrees, right? He admits that skill, virtuosity can be distracting, but if it's done properly, skill is an essential and really nice, perfect, an essential and a very nice element to form. Okay, so he writes, some features that at first sight seem extraneous belong, in fact, to expressiveness, for they further the development of an experience so as to give the satisfaction peculiar to striking fulfillment. This is true, for example, of evidence of unusual skill and of economy in use of means, when these traits are integrated with the actual work. Skill is then admired not as part of the external equipment of the artist, but as an enhanced expression belonging to the object, right? So a part of form. It belongs to the product and not merely the producer, because it is constituent of form, or it is a constituent of form. And I have a picture here of Jackie Chan, right? One of his older movies. I haven't watched these movies in a while, but I remember watching them, and he does his own stunts, and the movies themselves are not. They're not the most sophisticated plot-wise. The acting's not that great. Some of the storylines are kind of cheesy and all that stuff. But the action sequences are great. They're humorous. And his skill is a part of the appeal of the movie. And I don't know if what Dewey is saying would apply here. In a way, maybe his skill is the show stealer, right? It detracts from the other elements of the movie. But for me, it's really a part of the show. It's really a part of a Jackie Chan movie are the stunts. There's one movie where he's jumping up this scaffolding and doing these crazy balancing feats, and you're just like, looking at him and just wondering, geez, this guy is just amazing at his skill and dexterity and his ability to do all this stuff in one or two takes, right? It's just one long shot, right? So for Dewey, this is, if it's done effectively and it's not distracting from the overall effect of the work, it's a part of form, right? Skill is a part of form. And a very good part, effective part of form, at least it can be, right? Has this nice unifying factor. Okay, also, and this is another thing I think Kant and Schopenhauer would scoff at, but he's going to say that things like costliness and rarity are a part of form. We're also going to talk about elegance there at the bottom. So this is kind of a long quote, but these are also elements of form. That's not costliness like you might be thinking. So he explains here in the quote, costliness is also, like Santayana has pointed out, an element in expression. A costliness that has nothing in common with vulgar display of purchasing power. So again, it's not just like I'm showing off like how expensive my paints are, or how nice the canvas is, or how nice the frame is. So, don't get all too crazy, Mr. Kant. He's not saying that. But what he means is, rarity, kind of a rarity. This counts to intensify expression, whether the rarity is that of infrequent occurrence of patient labor, or because it has the glamour of a distant clime and initiates us into hardly known modes of living. That's what I guess I have represented here on the left, right? This is one of those rarity in that sense, because it has the glamour of a distant clime, right? This is Jihayu Lake. I don't know if that's how I'm supposed to say it, but you know, you have to climb far away. It's tucked away in the Min Mountains near the Tibetan Plateau, and it's beautiful in itself. But if you had to travel and do this long journey through the mountains, the beauty would be even more striking to you, right? It's one, it's more rare. The blue of the water may be more blue and vibrant to you after you have been through this long hike and struggled to find it, right? So rarity can be an effective part of form. Such instances of costliness are part of form because they operate, as do all factors of the new and unexpected, in promoting the building up of a unique experience. The familiar may also have this effect. I'm not really sure. The ellipses there, no, they don't tell much. I'm not leaving out much. He doesn't really get clear about how the familiar has the same effect. Maybe the only thing I could think of is sort of the example he gave in an earlier chapter about how if you bump into a friend of yours who maybe like a not even a friend, just someone who you barely know, a coworker who you don't talk to that much, but you run into him while you're on a faraway trip, then that might be because of its unexpectedness. Even if it's something familiar, it might have the same effect. Again, I don't know. I'm just sort of grasping at something to try to help him out here. Elegance as well, he mentions. Elegance is also a part of form, for he says it marks a work whenever subject matter moves to its conclusion with inevitable logic, right? So if there's this elegance and grace of movement, obviously that too would be a nice, an important constituent of form. Okay, well, I'm going to leave you. I'm going to end this video here. This is we're not quite as far as I'd hoped we get in this first video. Well, we're already at over 30 minutes, so I'm going to stop here on technique. He's going to argue that technique, much like skill, can also be a part of form. If it's not obtrusive and doesn't get in the way of the overall unity of the aesthetic experience. Okay, so we'll leave that for the next video. And then we'll move on to really the main focus of the chapter that we're on, right? The history of form, right? So it seems like he's still kind of taking care of some unfinished business here and kind of elaborating fully on his concept of form. So once we get through his comments here on technique, this kind of segues really nicely into the rest of the chapter where he actually gets to the nitty-gritty on the history of form, how forms develop through time in response, surprise, surprise, to direct lived experience, right? Obstacles that present themselves in artistic creation and expression. So we have that to look forward to in the next video, and hope you can join us for that one. That'll be another optional one for my students. If you're in my class, you can skip that one just like you probably skipped this one, and you're probably not even watching me see this, so what's the point? Anyway, thanks a lot again, and I would hope to see you guys on the other side.